I found my wife's secret phone after she refused intimacy, and everything changed. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. The screen of the phone I wasn't supposed to know about illuminated the dark bedroom, revealing a message that killed my marriage instantly. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. My wife, Sarah, was asleep beside me, her back turned, breathing in that deep, rhythmic way that used to bring me peace. Now, it only amplified the crushing silence of our bedroom. For the past year, we had been living as roommates. Actually, that's an insult to roommates. We were ghosts haunting the same suburban house. The physical intimacy hadn't just stopped, it had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a suffocating tension that I couldn't figure out how to break. Every time I tried to bridge the gap, a touch on the shoulder, a suggested date night, a quiet conversation about us, she recoiled. "Robert, I'm just so burnt out," she would sigh, rubbing her temples as if my mere presence gave her a migraine. "My job is draining the life out of me. Why do you always have to pressure me?" I absorbed the blame. I convinced myself I was being selfish, needy, and unsupportive of her demanding career. I was 36, devoted, analytical by nature, but completely blind to the reality right in front of my face. I thought our marriage was going through a rough patch, a storm we just had to weather. I spent my days trying to be the perfect husband, taking on all the household chores, cooking her favorite meals, stepping back to give her space. But as the soft, bluish glow from the unknown device reflected off the ceiling, the illusion of my life began to shatter. This wasn't a work phone. Sarah's company strictly used Apple devices. This was a sleek, black Android I had never seen in my life. It had slipped out of the deep pocket of her heavy winter coat when she tossed it over the bedroom chair. How long had she been carrying a second life in her pocket? I stared at the notification banner on the lock screen. Julian, thinking about our venue. What venue? My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. She even brought it up in couples therapy, skillfully steering the counselor to focus on my anxious attachment while she played the victim. I realized my entire existence was built on a terrifying, calculated lie. To understand the magnitude of that glowing screen, you have to understand the sheer psychological warfare of the last 6 months. It didn't happen overnight. The freeze crept in slowly, like a draft under the door, until the whole house was encased in ice. Sarah had always been ambitious, a senior consultant constantly managing high-stress clients. But lately, her stress had become a convenient, impenetrable shield. If I asked about her day, she was too exhausted to speak. If I tried to initiate even a simple hug, her body would go completely rigid. "Robert, please, I'm touched out," she would snap, her voice dripping with an irritation that made my stomach knot. The gaslighting was masterful. I remember a humid evening in July. I had cooked her favorite meal, trying to recreate our first anniversary. When she walked in, she didn't even look at the table. "I told you I had a massive migraine coming on," she lied. "Why would you make the house smell like garlic? You never listen." I spent that night eating alone, wondering how I had become such a failure of a partner. I suggested therapy. She agreed, but only on her terms. In the counselor's office, Sarah was an Oscar-worthy performer. She would cry softly, dabbing her eyes. "I just feel so broken," she told Dr. Evans. "I'm dealing with severe depression, and Robert's constant need for physical validation is suffocating me. I need him to be my rock, not another obligation." I sat there, drowning in guilt, apologizing for my unreasonable expectations. I read books on supporting a depressed spouse. I stopped initiating contact. I became a ghost in my own marriage, tiptoeing around her delicate emotional state. She started taking more weekend mental health retreats to clear her head. "I just need a few days at the spa in Sedona to reset," she'd say, packing her sleek overnight bag. I funded those trips from our joint savings, desperate to see my wife smile again. I thought I was being the ultimate supportive husband. I thought I was saving her life. How do you look at the woman you love when you know she's a phantom? I was mourning a marriage that was already dead. I didn't know she was using my empathy as a weapon against me. The discovery of the phone was entirely accidental, a cruel twist of fate masquerading as a mundane chore. It was late October, and the temperature had suddenly plummeted. Sarah was asleep, exhausted from yet another draining corporate strategy meeting that had run until 10 p.m. I decided to pull our winter coats out of the deep storage closet in the guest room to run them through the dry cleaner the next day. I grabbed Sarah's heavy wool trench coat, the expensive one she only wore for high-profile client dinners in colder cities. As I lifted it off the hanger, it felt unusually heavy on the left side. I assumed it was a forgotten tube of lipstick or maybe some old receipts she needed to expense. I slid my hand into the deep, silk-lined pocket. My fingers didn't find paper or makeup. They brushed against something hard, smooth, and distinctly metallic. I pulled it out, frowning in the dim hallway light. It was a black Samsung Galaxy. The screen was pristine, without a single scratch. My immediate thought wasn't betrayal. It was genuine confusion. Had her company switched providers? Did she find a client's phone? I pressed the power button out of pure reflex. The screen flared to life, showing a generic abstract wallpaper. And then, the notification popped up. Julian, thinking about our venue. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Venue? Who the hell was Julian? And why was he texting a phone I didn't know existed at 2 in the morning? I swiped the screen, hoping to read more, but was immediately met with a harsh numeric keypad. Enter PIN. The phone was locked tight. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, listening to the faint sound of Sarah breathing in the master bedroom. The realization washed over me in a sickening, freezing wave of dread. I wasn't holding a misplaced device. I was holding a vault that contained the darkest secrets of the woman I slept next to every night. This was a dedicated, secret line of communication, completely hidden from my view. I slipped the phone back into the coat pocket, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I knew I couldn't confront her without cracking that digital safe first. The next 4 days were an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. I left the phone in the coat, monitoring it like a toxic substance. Every time Sarah took a shower, I would sneak into the guest room, pull the device out, and stare at the PIN screen. I had a limited number of tries before the phone would inevitably lock me out or, worse, wipe its data completely. I had to be surgical. I started with the obvious. Her birthday. My birthday. Our anniversary. The date we bought the house. Nothing. Every failed attempt felt like a mocking laugh, a reminder of how little I actually knew her. I had to maintain the facade of the patient, understanding husband. I made her morning coffee. I asked how she was feeling. Still overwhelmed, Robert. Please don't hover, she'd sigh, barely looking up from her iPad. I nodded, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. I became obsessed. What numbers mattered to this alternate version of Sarah? What did she value more than our marriage? On the 5th night, she was asleep, and I was sitting on the bathroom floor with the burner phone, staring blankly at the keypad. I had 2 attempts left before a permanent lockout. I started mentally tracing back the timeline of her sudden withdrawal. When did she stop looking at me? When did the migraines start? It was late April. April 22nd, to be exact. She had returned from a 3-day leadership seminar in Austin and immediately moved to the opposite edge of the bed. She had been a different person ever since. My hands trembled as I typed in the numbers. 0-4-2-2. My breath caught in my throat. The screen hesitated for a fraction of a second. The lock icon opened with a soft, almost imperceptible click. The home screen populated with apps, laying her secret universe completely bare. I felt a terrifying rush of adrenaline mixed with profound, soul-crushing grief. I had bypassed the security, but I wasn't prepared for the sheer volume of deceit waiting for me inside. I tapped the messaging icon and watched my entire reality burn down. The messaging app was a pristine archive of my wife's alternate reality. There were only 2 contacts saved, Julian and Claire. I opened the thread with Julian, my fingers hovering over the glass as if it were burning hot. The visceral shock of those first few messages will haunt me for the rest of my life. This wasn't a cheap, dirty affair. It was an entire, meticulously constructed parallel life. The Sarah in these texts was vibrant, affectionate, and deeply passionate. Everything she claimed to be too depressed to be with me. I can't wait to see you this weekend, darling. The house feels so empty without you. Julian had written 3 days ago. Sarah's reply made my stomach violently heave. Counting the hours, my love. Just wrapping up some exhausting loose ends here. You are my absolute everything. Loose ends. That's what I was. A loose end. I scrolled back through months of daily communication. They talked about adopting a dog. They discussed the interior design of his new condo in Denver. And then, I found the photos. There were dozens of them. Sarah smiling brightly, a genuine, radiant smile I hadn't seen in years, standing next to a tall, handsome man with silver at his temples. They were at vineyards, on ski slopes, at fancy galas. But the most devastating detail wasn't the locations, it was the ring. In almost every photo, sitting proudly on her left hand, was a massive, brilliant-cut diamond engagement ring. She was playing house. She had cultivated an entirely separate identity as a single, successful woman who had finally found the love of her life. I sat on the cold bathroom tiles, struggling to pull air into my lungs. The gaslighting, the therapy sessions, the complaints about my neediness, it was all a calculated smokescreen. She was emotionally and physically bankrupting our marriage to invest all her energy into a new one. She wasn't depressed. She was just exhausted from managing 2 different fiancés in 2 different time zones. I felt a dangerous, icy calmness begin to replace my crushing grief. I needed to know exactly how she was funding this elaborate, sickening fantasy. I transitioned from a grieving husband into a forensic investigator. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but I compartmentalized it. I needed facts. I needed undeniable, ironclad evidence. I spent the hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. meticulously documenting every single detail from the burner phone. I used my own phone to take high-resolution photos of her text exchanges, her call logs, and the shared photo albums. I couldn't just forward things to my email. She might have tracking software or notice the data usage. Next, I pulled out my laptop and logged into our shared digital calendar, placing it side by side with the photos from the burner. The overlap was perfectly, brutally aligned. That mental health weekend in Sedona last August? The burner phone showed her drinking champagne on a balcony in Denver with Julian. The emergency crisis management seminar in Chicago last month? She was actually touring wedding venues in the Rockies. Every single time I had packed her bags, kissed her forehead, and told her to focus on her well-being, I was literally sending her off to her fiancé. The sheer logistics of her deception were staggering. She had to manage separate wardrobes, separate timelines, and entirely separate personas. When she complained to me about the grind of her corporate job, she was actually complaining about the stress of maintaining a monumental lie. I cross-referenced flight records and hotel bookings she had hidden in the burner's email app. The exact dates, the specific locations, it all matched the text with Julian. It was a documentary of betrayal, neatly organized by timestamp and geolocation. I compiled everything into a hidden, encrypted folder on my secure cloud drive. I was building a timeline that a jury could understand, a timeline that proved her depression was nothing more than a strategic withdrawal. But looking at the receipts, a glaring discrepancy emerged. The flights, the luxury hotels, the expensive dinners. Julian was wealthy, but Sarah was paying for a lot of her own travel to keep up the appearance of an equal partnership. I opened a new tab to check our joint bank accounts and felt my blood freeze. The financial bleed was worse than I could have ever imagined. I had always handled the day-to-day bills, but Sarah managed our high-yield savings and joint investment portfolios, claiming her financial acumen was better suited for long-term growth. I had trusted her implicitly. I logged into the primary joint portal, a site I hadn't scrutinized in months because she always provided a reassuring, summarized spreadsheet at the end of each quarter. Her spreadsheets, I now realized, were completely fabricated. Over the past 8 months, Sarah had been systematically draining our resources. There were thousands of dollars in ATM cash advances taken out in cities she wasn't supposed to be in. She had liquidated a significant portion of our mutual funds, classifying them on her fake spreadsheets as reinvestments into a volatile tech sector. The truth was glaringly bright on the actual bank ledger. She was funneling marital assets into a secret, individual checking account under her maiden name. I tracked the outbound transfers. That money paid for her frequent, first-class flights to Denver. It paid for the expensive vintage watch she had given Julian for his birthday. In transaction, I found immortalized in a glowing thank you text on the burner. She was stealing our future to finance her counterfeit present. The down payment we had been saving for a larger home, the nest egg we were supposed to use to start a family, it was all being siphoned away to support her lavish double life. I printed every single statement, highlighting the fraudulent transfers in a stark, neon yellow. I felt physically ill. She had not only broken my heart, she was actively robbing me blind. Every time she accused me of putting pressure on her, she was simultaneously stealing from my paycheck. The level of sociopathy required to sit across from your husband, cry about your mental health, and then secretly wire his money to your secret fiancé was incomprehensible. The most painful revelation wasn't the missing money, it was the name on the wire. The name on the incoming wire transfer was Claire Davies, Sarah's younger sister. There was a transaction for $500 marked simply as "Thanks for the cover." My hands gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. Claire. I had cooked Claire dinner. I had helped Claire move into her apartment. When Sarah was supposedly having her worst mental health days, I had called Claire, crying, asking for advice on how to better support her sister. Claire had sat in my living room, sipping my wine, looking me dead in the eye and telling me I just needed to give Sarah more space. I grabbed the burner phone and opened the second text thread. The messages between Sarah and Claire were a masterclass in cruelty. Robert is being so incredibly needy again. Sarah had texted in September. Can you tell him I'm staying at your place this weekend? Julian booked a surprise trip to Aspen. Claire's response was immediate. Got you covered, sis. Tell Jules I said hi. And don't worry, I'll text Robert tomorrow and tell him you're resting and not to call. My vision blurred with rage. My entire reality had been a staged play, and the supporting cast was actively mocking me from the wings. Claire wasn't just a passive bystander. She was a willing, active accomplice in my psychological torture. She provided the alibis, validated the gaslighting, and helped Sarah paint me as the oppressive, unsupportive villain in our marriage. The betrayal expanded exponentially. I wasn't just losing a wife. I was losing a family I thought I belonged to. I scrolled through dozens of messages where the two sisters laughed at my blind devotion. They mocked my attempts to schedule couples therapy. They ridiculed the romantic dinners I tried to plan. Every act of love I offered was dissected and sneered at in this digital echo chamber. I wasn't a husband to them. I was an obstacle, a naive bank account that needed to be managed until Sarah was ready to jump ship. I locked the phone and replaced it, my heart completely devoid of any mercy. The next morning tested the absolute limits of my sanity. Sarah came down to the kitchen, her face set in its usual mask of exhaustion and irritation. I was pouring coffee, my mind racing with the images of her fake engagement ring and Claire's mocking texts. I handed her a mug. She took a sip, slammed it down on the granite counter, and glared at me. I can't believe you bought the dark roast again, she snapped. I told you it gives me acid reflux. Do you even pay attention to anything I say, Robert? Or are you just entirely wrapped up in yourself? It was a textbook reverse gaslight. She needed to establish dominance for the day to keep me on the defensive. Before last night, I would have apologized profusely and rushed out to buy her preferred blend. Today, staring into the eyes of a stranger, I had to swallow the absolute truth burning on my tongue. I had to play the apologetic, pathetic husband she expected me to be. I'm so sorry, Sarah, I said, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. I wasn't thinking. I know you've been under so much stress. Let me go to the cafe and get you something else. She let out a long, dramatic sigh. Don't bother. I don't have time. I'm just so tired of feeling like I'm managing this household alone. The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh. She was managing two households and doing a terrible job at both. I nodded submissively, looking down at my hands. Every fiber of my being wanted to scream, to flip the table, to throw the burner phone in her face. But that would ruin everything. If I confronted her now, she would spin it. She would delete the evidence, move the money, and play the victim in the divorce. I smiled weakly, kissed her on the cheek, and told her to have a wonderful day at work. As she drove away in the car I paid for, I felt my soul turn to absolute ice. I picked up my phone and dialed the most ruthless divorce attorney in the county. Lawyer Davis was a man who didn't deal in emotions. He dealt in leverage. Sitting in his mahogany-paneled office, I laid out the printed spreadsheets, the high-resolution photos from the burner phone, and the meticulously documented timeline of Sarah's financial fraud. Davis, a sharp, unsmiling man in his 50s, adjusted his glasses and reviewed the evidence in absolute silence for 10 minutes. When he finally looked up, there was a glint of predatory satisfaction in his eyes. Your wife, he said flatly, has made several critical, legally catastrophic mistakes. We spent the next 3 weeks building an impenetrable arsenal. I operated in absolute stealth. I continued to play the subservient, worried husband at home, absorbing Sarah's complaints and gaslighting with a blank, placid expression. Meanwhile, Davis was executing a surgical strike on her hidden life. We legally froze the marital assets she hadn't yet touched. We initiated a silent trace on her secret checking account, documenting every cent she had siphoned away for Julian. I forwarded hundreds of emails from her burner to a secure server, creating an undeniable chain of custody for the digital evidence. We don't just file for divorce, Davis advised, tapping a pen against his desk. We file for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and we prepare to subpoena her sister as a hostile witness if necessary. But the most powerful weapon you have right now is the element of surprise. When we strike, she cannot have a single avenue of escape. He drafted the divorce papers not as a negotiation, but as a total unconditional surrender. It demanded full restitution of the stolen funds and heavily favored me in the asset division. Everything was perfectly aligned legally, but I needed something more. I needed a personal reckoning. I needed her to feel the exact devastation she had inflicted on me, witnessed by the people who had helped her build the lie. I couldn't just hand her an envelope in the kitchen. I needed to burn her counterfeit world to the ground in front of an audience. Before I could spring the trap, I had to understand the other side of the equation. I needed to know exactly who Julian was. Using the information gleaned from the burner phone, I ran a deep background check. Julian wasn't a villain. He was a wealthy, successful architect living in Denver, completely oblivious to his starring role in my wife's twisted psychological thriller. I found his social media profiles, which were public and heavily curated. There she was, my wife, smiling in his posts, tagged as the incredible woman who changed my life. Reading Julian's captions, a strange realization washed over me. He had no idea I existed. In his mind, Sarah was a brilliant, stressed single woman who traveled constantly for her high-powered consulting job. He was planning a wedding, picking out floral arrangements, and buying real estate with a woman who was legally bound to another man. Sarah had manipulated him just as thoroughly as she had manipulated me. She was playing a dangerous, high-stakes game of emotional roulette, confident she was smart enough to keep the two boards separate forever. I formulated a plan to collapse her reality from both ends simultaneously. I printed out a very specific selection of documents. I included a copy of our marriage certificate, a recent photo of Sarah and me standing in our kitchen, and a printed transcript of the texts where Sarah complained to her sister about managing my needy husband. I placed them in a sleek, overnight delivery envelope addressed to Julian's architectural firm in Denver. I timed the shipping perfectly. I didn't include a threatening letter or a dramatic explanation, just the cold, hard, undeniable facts of her deception. He deserved to know the truth before he married a phantom. With the package scheduled to arrive on a Friday afternoon, I turned my attention to the home front. It was time to host the most important, destructive dinner party of my entire life. The setup required absolute precision and a sociopathic level of calm. I approached Sarah on Tuesday, adopting my best tone of concerned, gentle submission. "Honey, I know how incredibly burnt out you've been feeling," I said, carefully watching her eyes. "I talked to Claire, and I thought it might be nice to have your parents and her over for dinner this Friday. No pressure, just a supportive family evening. I'll cook your favorite, and we can just relax. You deserve a break." Sarah sighed, playing the weary martyr perfectly. "Fine, Robert, if you insist, but don't make it a huge production. I really don't have the emotional bandwidth for a long night." She had no idea that her emotional bandwidth was about to be permanently severed. Friday arrived. The house smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary. The dining room table was set with our finest china. At 4 p.m., I received a notification on my phone. The package had been signed for at Julian's office in Denver. The fuse was officially lit. At 6:30 p.m., Sarah's parents arrived, followed shortly by Claire. Claire hugged me, flashing a bright, entirely fake smile. "It's so good of you to do this, Robert. Sarah really needs the support right now." I smiled back, looking directly into her eyes, knowing I possessed the text where she called me a pathetic loser. We sat down at the formal dining table. I poured the wine. Sarah sat at the head of the table, massaging her temples, looking appropriately miserable for her audience. Her parents murmured sympathetically about her demanding career. The conversation flowed normally for about 20 minutes. I waited until everyone had finished their appetizers, ensuring they were comfortable, relaxed, and entirely unprepared for what was coming. I stood up slowly, tapping my wine glass with a fork. The room fell silent as I pulled a small, black remote from my pocket. Thank you all for being here to support Sarah through this difficult period of exhaustion. I began, my voice steady, devoid of any warmth. I pressed the remote. Behind Sarah, the large smart TV mounted on the dining room wall clicked on. The screen mirrored my laptop. I didn't show a slideshow. I showed a live, open folder of evidence. The first image was a high-resolution photo of Sarah kissing Julian on a balcony in Denver, the massive diamond ring sparkling clearly on her finger. Sarah whipped around. The color violently drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. "Robert, what is this?" her father demanded, half standing. I ignored him, my eyes locked on Claire. I clicked to the next slide. The exact text messages between the two sisters mocking my attempts to save the marriage. "This," I said calmly, "is Claire providing an alibi so my wife could fly to Colorado and play house with her secret fiancé. Thank you for covering for her, Claire. It was very helpful." Claire shrank back into her chair, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped fish. "Stop it. Turn it off." Sarah shrieked, her carefully crafted facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. She lunged for the television, but there was nothing she could unplug. I reached under my chair and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope Lawyer Davis had prepared. I tossed it onto the center of the table, right next to the roasted lamb. It landed with a definitive, heavy thud. "Those are the divorce papers, Sarah. They outline the exact amount of marital funds you embezzled to pay for your second life, which you will be paying back in full." The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating, and beautifully destructive. Her parents stared at her, horrified, recognizing the undeniable reality projected on the screen. She had nowhere to hide. She opened her mouth to scream at me, but then her burner phone began to ring. The ringing of the burner phone, a device I had quietly slipped out of her coat and placed on the sideboard behind her, cut through the dining room like a siren. Sarah froze, staring at the black device as if it were a live grenade. She knew I had found it. She knew I had unlocked it. "Answer it, Sarah," I commanded, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "It's Julian. I imagine he just finished reading the package I sent to his office. He probably has some questions about your husband." Panic, pure and unadulterated, consumed her. "Robert, please, let's just talk about this privately," she begged, tears streaming down her face. It was the first genuine emotion I had seen from her in over a year. But it wasn't remorse, it was terror. Her father, finally grasping the magnitude of the situation, demanded she answer the phone. With trembling hands, she picked it up and put it on speaker. The voice that filled the room was shaking with a rage that matched my own. "You're married?" Julian's voice cracked through the speaker. "You have a husband? The photos, the marriage certificate, you psychotic liar. Do not ever contact me again. The wedding is off. The locks are changed." The call disconnected with a sharp beep. The collapse of her empire was instantaneous and absolute. She fell to her knees right there in the dining room, sobbing hysterically, begging her parents for help. But her mother was already standing up, grabbing her purse, unable to look at her own daughter. Claire was practically sprinting for the front door, desperate to escape the fallout of her complicity. I stood at the head of the table, entirely untouched by her tears. The gaslighting, the fake therapy sessions, the financial drain, it was all finally over. I walked past her sobbing form, picked up my coat, and headed for the door. I left her kneeling in the ashes of the 2 lives she had destroyed. The aftermath of the dinner party was a blur of legal brutality and deafening silence. Sarah tried to contest the divorce, claiming emotional distress and attempting to spin her double life as a mental breakdown. But Lawyer Davis crushed her with the sheer weight of the documented fraud. Confronted with the threat of a civil suit for embezzlement, wire fraud, and the undeniable proof of her hidden accounts, she capitulated completely. She signed the papers, surrendering her claim to the house, her portion of the shared investments, and legally binding herself to repay every stolen dollar. Julian, true to his word, vanished completely from her life. leaving her with no fiancé, no husband, and a shattered reputation among her family. Healing wasn't instantaneous. You don't just walk away from years of intense psychological manipulation without deep scars. I spent months in intensive therapy, learning to slowly untangle the intricate web of gaslighting she had wrapped around my mind. I had to learn how to trust my own perception of reality again. The most difficult lesson was forgiving myself for believing her lies, for thinking that my absolute devotion could somehow cure a depression that was actually just calculated deceit. But with every passing week, the heavy, suffocating fog lifted a little more, revealing a stronger version of myself. I sold the suburban house. It held too many ghosts, too many memories of the cold shoulder and the agonizing silent treatments. I bought a smaller, sunlit apartment closer to the city center, a space entirely my own. The silence in my new home isn't the crushing, tense quiet of a dying marriage. It's the peaceful, breathing silence of absolute freedom. To anyone who feels like they are drowning in a relationship, constantly blamed for the friction, constantly feeling inadequate, trust your gut. If your reality feels fundamentally wrong, start looking closer at the details. I survived the ultimate betrayal, and the beautiful, honest peace I have now was worth everything.